Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again for joining us as the latest edition of our ASMIA webinars. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of ASMIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's exciting and very interesting webinar. We have the privilege and opportunity to hear from our friend Bill Miles about Niger. As you can see, his extensive bio in the invitation. Bill had the opportunity and a privilege and opportunity, but really an experience that he will talk about this afternoon as far as being evacuated on a French military transport following the coup in Niger on July 26th. So he has on-the-ground insights as to what is going on and where we're going. The format will be as such. We are also joined with our colleague Robert Lloyd, who is also an Africanist and the vice president of the board of ASMIA. He will have a conversation with Bill after he's done his remarks, and then we'll go into Q&A. There's a lot to discuss and a lot to unpack here. We will do our best to tackle all the questions that you may have. If we do not get to your questions, feel free to email us after the webinar. So really, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Robert, who will introduce Bill, and then we will start the webinar from there. So thank you again for joining us.
Again, my name is Robert Lloyd, and a warm welcome to all those joining us by the webinar. Delighted that you're here. I think we're in for a very special next hour. We are joined, as you all know, by Professor Bill Miles. He's got his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and he's currently professor of political science at Northeastern University in Boston. In 2022-23, he was a Fulbright Global Scholar in Israel, Morocco, and India. His expertise and work on Niger goes back to the 1970s, so he's no stranger to the country, when he served as a Peace Corps volunteer and learned Hausa, a local language. So he's been returning ever since then to Niger, and so he has a wealth of experience on the area, and plus in his functional areas, taking a look at the role of development, economic development, religion, terrorism, counterterrorism. So I think there's plenty of fodder here for good discussions on today's Niger. So at this point, a warm welcome to Professor Miles, and I will turn it over to you, my colleague.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert and Asaf, for the invitation. Suzanne Sloan and Emily Lucas behind the scenes making all this happen. And I just want to put in a plug for ASMIA for people who are not familiar but are tuning in. It's not an association of people interested in the Middle East or in Africa alone. It really is combined, and having a foot in both of those regions makes this the perfect place for anybody who's interested in both the African sub-Saharan continent and in the Middle East per se. So I start with an apology. I have too many slides, but I will race through them so that we can get to them all. And I will share my screen at this point. And Robert will let me know if it's coming up.
You're looking good from my end.
Okay. Well, in that case, then I do have to ask you as an ASMIA official, how is it that you were able to time our discussion today for the first time in history that the United States and Russia, since the Cold War, have had to share space in the airbase that just this morning has been occupied by the Russians, and it's a U.S. airbase that has been in Niger for over a decade now. So I don't know what kind of intelligence you guys have, but the timing is really formidable. So the title, as we first came up with it, is Just Another Coup, What's at Stake in Niger? But when I was preparing last week or so, and given everything that was going on and holidays, I thought that I might change the title from what you see on the screen to why is this coup different from all other coups? And that's really the point of the webinar. And as in the Passover Seder, where the answer to the question, why is this night different from all other nights, has 4 answers, I'm going to give up front my 4 answers of why this coup, the one in Niger, should be thought of differently from all of those other coups which our map shows. So the first answer to the question, why is this different from all others, has to do with a certain kind of a substance that one ingests, a certain kind of cake. So in the case of Niger, the first major takeaway is Niger has yellow cake, uranium. No other country comes close on the continent to producing the amount of uranium that can be used for civilian and military purposes as Niger until you get down to Namibia and South Africa. So that's number 1. Number 2, no other country which has recently had a coup in the African continent has US surveillance drones situated in that country. And that's what Niger has represented in terms of counterterrorism, security in that part of the world, again, for over a decade now. And the third major of the 4 takeaways, what makes Niger's coup different, it has to do with its relationship with Nigeria. Nigeria, which is the giant of West Africa. And what happens in Nigeria does not stay in Nigeria. And conversely, Niger sharing a boundary with Nigeria will go into why that security relationship is so special. But it's not only because they share part of their names, it's mostly because of the ethnic makeup of both Niger and Nigeria, which differentiates Niger from Chad, Cameroon, Benin, Mali, Burkina Faso, other surrounding areas. It's the Hausa nation, the Hausa people, I should say. By far the largest ethnic and ethno-religious group in Niger, and in Nigeria, the Hausa Fulani of the north as well. So they really are bonded in special ways. And fourth and final of the takeaways has to do with the interplay between poverty and democracy and poverty. The United States and European nations have been putting a lot of effort and money into shoring up Niger's democracy in a country which, since the Human Development Index was actually invented in 1990, Niger has scored more often than any other country at the bottom of the list of developed nations. And you can see, depending on your screen size, that Niger's GNI per capita is extremely low. So if Niger can maintain or restore democracy despite its poverty, that is very significant. Okay. As mentioned, I have an article that goes more deeply into what we'll be talking about this hour, and I will be happy to share with anybody who does contact ASMEA the recent publication. So, Mohamed Bazoum, elected president in 2021. It was a peaceful transfer, the first in Niger's history, from a previously civilian elected president. That was quite a feat. I was there in Niger for July, and on the 25th, I was reminded that my flight home was to begin on the 28th, and before that happened was the coup. A coup whose ostensible reasons are not the actual reasons. I'll be getting into that. But the upshot was that everybody else, on account of the closure of the borders, the airspace, the airport, were stuck in Niger for an indefinite period of time. General Chiani took over on that date, put President Bazoum under detention, and to this day, in the presidential palace, President Bazoum is still holed up. He's basically in under house arrest because he will not cede power. He will not give up his office as legitimately elected president of Niger. And I don't know of any standoff between an elected president and his military successor has gone on for so long. Right after the coup, ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, started to put pressure on Niger. And just as soon after, the French embassy was attacked. I and a colleague, Professor Scott Youngstedt, were holed up in our compound about a mile away from the French embassy. And the signs, down with France, long live Putin, were a surprise to, I think, everybody who had been monitoring the scene. Flight was canceled. And the attack on the French embassy raised the question, would the American embassy be spared? It was at that initial time, but I still had to get out of Niger. And France took the lead in an evacuation as a result of my marriage to a French citizen, which I was able to get access to. The French let me on their plane, military transport that was run by French military forces. It was a government of France plane that the French Army and Space Forces actually operated. Some of the more pleasant uniformed attendants I've ever had the honor of flying with. And we made it to Paris before the US had actually announced any evacuation of US expatriates. Interesting to note that on my plane, and I think most of the French evacuees are of African descent or Afro-Caribbean descent. Need to think about that in terms of our stereotypes of what represents France, who represents France. The equivalent of the French Red Cross waiting for us. So to anticipate the question, what was I doing in Niger in the first place? Well, in the very first place, this is a test that I like to give students and friends alike. Can you identify me way back when I first went to Niger? Extra credit for anybody who can type in, identify that I'm the long-haired one, bearing very little resemblance to the figure you see in front of you today. That little square that little square with the red around it, that's where I served, lived for 2 years, learned the Hausa language. My school. And the head of state when I arrived. Lieutenant Seni Kunche had taken power 3 years before my Peace Corps class arrived in Niger. And he remained head of state up until my research that resulted in this book, comparing the Hausa of Niger with the Hausa of Nigeria. And I was there during this coup in Nigeria. So it's not the first time last summer that I was directly affected by a coup in Nigerian Hausa land. I added on this chapter when General Muhammad Buhari took over. I don't know if you see my cursor, but in the from the elected president of Nigeria, Shehu Shagari. So eventually, and unusually, President Kunche of Niger died of natural causes while in office, and Colonel Saibu, who took over, was succeeded by President Ali Saibu. In other words, the same man changed his clothes, said he's no longer an officer, now he's a civilian, but he's the one who succeeded himself from military to civilian president. And this is actually quite a pattern that often happens. We had the civilian leader, Mohammed Usman, who was overthrown in 96. Eventually, there were elections. And once again, the coup leader changed his colors, changed his uniform, changed his headwear, and had himself elected president. Supposedly by accident, he was assassinated by his own presidential guards. And another military officer retired, Mohamedou Tanja, in 1999, he took power. So during all of these years is when I was writing these particular articles on different aspects of Nigerian development, religion, politics, and foreign aid. Tanja proposed in another coup by Isufu Mahamadou. And there was that peaceful transfer that I mentioned between Isufu and Bazoum until the coup of last summer. And so one of the things that I just wanted to point out is how Nigerian politics has been a pendulum swing between civilian and military leadership since independence till as we speak today. I want to invoke Professor Robert Charlick, who wrote the book on personalistic politics in Niger. And the question rising, why did the coup take place? Anybody who studies politics in Africa, much of the developing world, knows that you've got to take care of your military. If you don't, that's what's going to undermine you. And it's no secret that Chiani was being thought to be demoted, transferred to another post, would lose many of his perks and prerogatives. So Niger, as I said earlier, the least developed nation, according to United Nations statistics, since those began. And here you can see some of those comparative stats as of just a couple of years ago. It's nothing to be proud of that Niger currently has Chad and South Sudan under them in terms of their level of poverty and development. And just to give some visuals of what, as a Peace Corps volunteer and as recent as last summer, I was experiencing having to fend for yourself, cooking for energy, for cooking, and I have to give you a trigger warning, people who are blind, people who are begging, people who have emotional problems, but are on the streets, people who have leprosy, which is still endemic in Niger. Health challenges galore. Water is a very basic issue, and I just show a picture of a water bottle because I was asked from somebody, not for my water, but for the empty bottle. So much in need are they of those kinds of working tools. So corruption has been a constant issue. But I want to highlight the resilience of the Nigerian people. And this book by Professor Scott Youngstead really captures it in the title, that survival through dignity and cultural strength. Just to go quickly through the major changes that I've experienced since I've been going to Niger. One is the birth rate, the demography. The world's highest birth rate is Niger. And those people are clustered in a very confined area of the country. Changes in technology, how cell phone use has revolutionized communications and development in Niger. And security. These blue markings of internally displaced persons really reflect those areas which in the last 10 years have been experiencing great security threats from Boko Haram in this area, ISIS spin-offs in this area, and a lot of banditry from Nigeria seeping over the border. Just recently, my colleague Olivier Walter has published through the Sahelian Network, Club Secretariat, a couple of excellent works highlighting insecurity in West Africa. And one of the major points that they are highlighting now is the rivalry between different terrorist groups. And you can see again where they're clustered and how quickly the armed groups are moving and wreaking havoc along Niger's borders in areas that have been new compared to these most previous years. Another major change that I've experienced or witnessed throughout the years has to do with religion and politics in Niger. How the notion of Sharia, again, it's a migration from Nigeria that the polity should be run according to Islamic law. When I first went to Niger, this is how girls of prepubescent girls would dress. And my most recent trip, you'll see girls of roughly the same age now in hijab or other Muslim acceptable prescribed dress. And I'm a border guy. I spend a lot of time on the borders, and this gentleman is in Nigeria. This gentleman is in Niger. It's the basis of the book, A House of Land Divided. But since 9/11, even the classical line in the sand, which you see as the border, has been replaced by a border infrastructure. This is in that same location. The poles are right behind it. This is a Nigerian immigration station. Here are their officers. And that emphasis on border sort of explains what I was doing in Niger the month of the coup itself. I was looking at border infrastructure, border development, as promoted by the National Commission of Borders of the Nigerian government. And also the bilateral Nigerian Commission for Cooperation and Development. Because, as I said earlier, this borderland between Niger and Nigeria is so crucial for the economic prosperity of Niger and important for Nigeria's projection of influence of power, and also necessary for working together to combat terrorist groups that use the porous, hitherto unpatrolled border areas as a place for doing their action. And last summer, the week before the coup itself, I went back to the area where I had been Peace Corps volunteer, and in these two villages on the Nigerian side, we held a meeting of the National Boundary Commission to sensitize villagers about conditions and what they should do to report such unusual activities as theft, murder, what have you. This, by the way, you're all invited. This is my home in the village in Niger, where I've done my research. So just let me know when you're going to be in the neighborhood. And I've got 2 huts to open up to you. So where are we now in Niger? At least since the coup. The Nigerian government turned the coup into an anti-French jihad, in a sense, and France eventually had to cede to the Nigerian government's demands that they remove their troops. The United States, having this important base, 2 bases actually, in Niamey, the capital, and in up in Agadez in the north, having the ability through drones to monitor, to surveil as far as the drones from Djibouti in the US drone base from there were able to do. So that's basically half the continent of the north. At the same time, putting pressure on Europe, the government of Niger loosened restrictions of people who were using Agadez as a transit point to get to the northern part of Africa, taking boats across the Mediterranean to Europe. And the money that was being put to try to keep people in Agadez is no longer working. The Nigerian government is putting pressure on Europe as well. So Mali, Burkina, with Niger leaving the ECOWAS folding, basically saying that they are not going to continue their blockade. And then the US goes into the scope of the Nigerians who say, we want the imperialists, the neo-imperialists to leave. And with our two bases, the US two bases, we've been trying to find a way to remain, even as the Russians have been invited in. This is the sign from the coup itself. And I said from the beginning that when the Nigerians are flying Russian flags, they're not going into their local store and buying a Russian flag because there are no flag stores in Niger. There certainly has been a covert operation and preparation to have Russian influence and symbols of influence promoted and I won't say deployed, but distributed. And as I said at the very beginning, just today, in the base where we still have American troops, Russians are moving in. So getting in my last 2 minutes, I just wanted to invoke first a proverb that I've slightly modified. Because what we're hearing and reading, I do not believe reflects at all the cultural ethos of the Nigerian people. This is, I think, much more reflective of who the Nigerian commoners are, that they are people living in poverty who are dignified and still generous, and are trying to make their way in this post-Cold War, but US-Russian conflict time. One thing I didn't mention, no time in terms of ethnicity, but there is an interesting musical scene in Niger, and the Tuaregs, I think, who are an ethnic group that we've got to keep our eyes on as the tensions arise. They are not only desert warriors in the past, resisted the French longer than anybody else in the Sahel, but they're very good musicians, and they're using their music to make political points as well. So to go back to the 4 main takeaways, and why is this coup different from all other coups in West Africa? The fact that Niger has uranium that is of interest not only to Russia, but we know also to Iran. No other of those countries has that. The existence of those drone bases, which are now literally being taken over by Russia, at least in part. The important role of Nigeria for what happens in West Africa and how other countries are affected. And going back to that poverty democracy nexus. If we can't thread the needle of democracy through that little eye that poverty creates, then the enterprise is challenged everywhere. So in addition to the Asmiya people and those whom you're seeing before, I do need to acknowledge, and you're wondering why do I have to thank Benjamin Franklin? Because he founded the scholarly American Philosophical Society, which provided the funding for me to go to Niger last summer. And I encourage other Asmiya people who have not had the ability to yet enjoy Asmiya travel grants or research grants to think of the APS as another venue. So with that, and I think I'm really at exactly my 30-minute of presentation mode, I will stop sharing my screen and pivot back to this laptop.
Thank you, Professor Miles, for your presentation. Very informative, particularly on the 4 takeaways that makes this coup different than perhaps some of the others, or at least the factors. We can look at the external factors affecting Nigeria, or excuse me, on Niger, and also the internal factors. So I'd like to focus on that because I'm sure there will be plenty of questions on the geopolitics of the region. My first question is, and these 2 questions are related. Would you say that Niger meets sort of the basic standards of what we would call a failed state? In other words, no control over borders, rules passed but not enforced, outside actors working within a territory, an economic system, a lack of familiarity and regularity in normal life routines.
Right. Okay. So, great question, Robert. I do have to point out that Foreign Policy magazine, which came up with the notion of a failed state, has gone away from that term, even though we all know that that's really what's happening. What do they call it now? A challenge state or
Fragile.
Fragile. Yes, thank you. So I think Niger really is in that zone between being fragile and being failed. Because a failed state is a Somalia, okay? Certainly taking an African, where you've got widespread violence, where there is no control by the people in the capital over all of its territory, where there are no services, public services, where the infrastructure is completely broken down. So I would not call Niger a state which is failed, but it is fragile, and it's becoming more and more fragile as the competition for power in the country does intensify. When you have an elected president who is, I don't know how he actually subsists with his family, not leaving from July of 2023 until May of 2024. What kind of message does that send? You asked about domestically, to the rest of the people, to all of those millions of Nigerians who voted for him. Nigerians had been getting closer to the notion of democracy being a continuous process of becoming consolidated. That's obviously not happening. And the real question is, and what concerns my friends in my fieldwork area, and the vast majority of Nigerians who live outside of urban areas, is what can the government do to help alleviate the material challenges that they're facing. And that includes adaptation to climate change. That includes lows in agricultural productivity, harvests that are failing. I mean, these are the most important things for the Nigerian people. And that's something that the United States and USAID has always been at the forefront of addressing. And we're still doing that even under these very fraught political conditions. So it's a challenging question, and so I'll just say somewhere between failed and fragile, or fragile and failed.
So my second and last related question, because again, I'm sure there are plenty of questions that want to be asked, is for the Hausa ethno-linguistic group. do we see ourselves as Hausa primarily, or do we see ourselves as being a citizen of Niger? Do we have greater affinity with our colleagues across the border in Nigeria? In other words, if Niger is failing to provide for its people, is our identity shifting to our local and to ethno-linguistic?
So, Robert, I think you must have had a peek at my very first publication on that topic in the American Political Science Review, that I went back, and that's precisely the questions that I was asking. And the answer then was that the Nigerian Hausa displayed much more national consciousness and therefore nationalism, much more identification with the Nigerian state than the Hausa of Nigeria did vis-a-vis the Nigerian state. And I think that what we're seeing play out now as a result of the coup actually reinforces those findings, that the rally around the flag, even if it now is also the Russian flag, in addition to the Nigerian flag, has to do with the ability of the coup leaders to say, Niger is for the Nigerians. And the French, former colonizers, and their Western allies, now the United States is involved, are an affront to the notion of true independence for our country. Nigerian Hausa are in a very different ethnic dynamic because there are major ethnic groups, the Yoruba and the Igbo in particular, who vie for political power in that ethnic triad in ways that the Hausa of Niger do not have to do, as being a majority, if not a plurality.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure there are other questions. So Suzanne, I believe I'm turning it over to you for the Q&A that follows.
Yes, indeed. We have many excellent questions that have come through, and we will start with Steve Onyewu, as me a member, who writes, ousted President Bazoum's daughter claimed recently that former President Issoufou was behind the coup because he wanted to create an atmosphere of crisis and return to power. He is an ally of the head of the military junta, Tchani. It is also claimed that Bazoum was in the process of dismissing Tchani, and that is why the latter struck first. In other words, the coup has little to do with the poor state of the Niger economy. To what extent is the Niger coup due to internal power play between the political and military elites?
Alluded to this in earlier in the presentation, that it is the presidential guard led by Tchani, whose position was known already being was in danger because of his demotion or at least transfer elsewhere, and that I accept as being the real precipitation for the action. And getting back to Robert's question, the rally around the flag, Niger for the Nigerians, out with the French, and now out with the Americans, I do see that as a way of trying to deflect attention away from those internal domestic reasons. And the fact that the United States held off for so long to finally call the coup a coup, because of, according to American legislation, once we have done that, we no longer can provide most of our development aid and assistance. So we held off as long as could be reasonably done. And so, yes, I can confirm from my point of view that much of what we're reading about and seeing about now is a continuation of the need for the junta to take attention away from the reason in the first place. In terms of Issoufou and his role in the coup itself, I had heard those rumors before. His relationship with Gianni, I won't comment on.
Okay, thank you. So Scott Swinton asks if there is also an ethnic backstory to the coup in Niger.
So that's something that I looked at very carefully immediately after the coup, because and this is what you do, you look at names and you, in the context of Niger, is this person Zarma? And I'll explain what Zarma is in a second. In this context, is he Hausa? Is he Pul? Fulani? Is he Tamashek speaking? Is he Tuareg? The Zarma inherited from the French both military and political power. And the French commandant in the early 20th century decided to move Niger's capital from Zinder, which was a Hausa enclave, to Niamey, which really didn't exist except as a farming village and fishing village near the Niger River, surrounded by the Zarma. They started to recruit Zarma to work for the military, work in the military, soldiers. And that had been the pattern for the first 2 decades, I would say, of Nigerian independence, that the Zarma were in control. But with, in the early 1990s, the beginning of a democratization, then you did have popular voting, Hausa becoming more prominent in politics and in the military as well. So I would say that this particular coup does not have an important ethnic dimension to it the way that Nigerian politics had previously. The fact that Mohammed Bazoum had been elected in the first place, he comes from a very, very small ethnic group in Niger. He is like a 1% or 2% of the indigenous Arab-speaking Nigerians. So that was a sign of ethnic opening, but that's certainly not the reason why he was deposed.
Okay. Emmanuel Obua asks, has the departure of Niger from ECOWAS affected its relations with Nigeria?
Oh, well, wow. That is such an important question because Nigeria is Niger's lifeline. Immediately after the coup and the blockade, the most important thing that Niger lost was electricity, because I think something like 85% of Niger's domestic energy supply comes from Nigeria itself. And then there are all the products that it imports, all the manufactured goods that could not officially legally cross the border. So, and the presidency of Niger, of ECOWAS is currently with Nigeria. So, the ECOWAS saying we're going to do this to put pressure on Niger was basically Nigeria saying that we're going to do that. And there was even question of Nigeria leading an ECOWAS military force to intervene to restore President Bazoum to power and restore democracy. ECOWAS folded, as I said earlier, as France folded. And for two reasons. No Nigerian leader wants to see Nigerians put in the position of having to use perhaps fatal power against Nigerians, especially if you've got Hausa on one side of the border in uniform and Hausa on the other side of the border in uniform. So that's the main reason why they backpedaled. And economically, you know, you may not want to shoot your co-ethnic because she is a co-ethnic, but you also don't want to starve them either. You don't want to make conditions too difficult. And that's why eventually ECOWAS, and again, Nigeria is a proxy for ECOWAS in this kind of discussion, has loosened those as well. So highlighting the importance of ECOWAS is a way of highlighting the importance of Nigeria and vice versa, particularly vis-a-vis Niger.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move to a question from Nathan DeVere, and he writes, now that U.S. forces are being forced to leave Niger, not to mention Chad, is there another viable country in the Sahel region to which such forces might be moved and repurposed to aid in the fight against Islamic terror networks?
So, hello, Nathan. One of the things that the work of Olivier Walter and colleagues has been highlighting is that the instability of the violence in the Sahel is spreading towards the Gulf of Guinea countries. And so there is the possibility that a place like Benin or Togo or Ghana would be both a more hospitable venue for U.S. military forces and places who, while not being challenged in the same way, to the same extent as the Burkina, Mali, Niger, Guinea, etc., maybe they would go there. Let's not forget Senegal, though, and Senegal, which has recently had a challenged but successful democratic transition, is also a place in the Sahel where I think we may be seeing a transfer of U.S. troops towards.
Okay, I'm going to pivot to Joseph Spurl's question, and he asks, how widespread is pro-Putin, pro-Russian sentiment among the common people?
Joe, thank you for that question. So all of the images that we saw after the coup, the Russian flags, the Viva Putin, you know, I immediately said, while we were there at the coup, excuse me, I just got to take a little. That there must be some Russians already in place with these products, with these flags, with these symbols, be able to make these placards for a country that the vast majority of Nigerians haven't given a second thought to. The coup, to a very large extent, and the politics, obviously it's in Niamey, the capital Niger phenomenon. And it is not a widespread sentiment. There is no Russophilia, very much to the east of Niamey. But political parties which exist, which are going to align themselves with the military, they may start making pro-Russian sounds, but these signs and symbols should not at all be exaggerated and taken as proof of pro-Russian sentiments on the part of Nigerian people per se. And I'll just give an example that goes back to a previous period. In the village, the very peaceful village where I lived to do my research after Peace Corps, you could buy Osama bin Laden little decals and stuff. Did not mean that people were pro bin Laden, were pro Al-Qaeda. These are just artifacts of the outside world that are used and then misunderstood, not understood, and maybe now being abused, but not in a way that is going to change the minds and the hearts of your average Nigerian.
Great. Okay, so I think this is unfortunately going to be the last question that we pose here. This has been an excellent, very informative webinar. The last question today will be from Jose Bay, who writes, Niger has accused the French of promoting terrorist organizations. Why? Upon what evidence or events are the Nigerians drawing that conclusion? Is it a baseless assertion, or are there some kernels of truth?
So this is the first time I've heard that particular rumor, but that gives me the opportunity to end with an important point in terms of technology and communication and politics and misinformation and disinformation. You know, I didn't even know what TikTok was myself, and until I was receiving shared TikTok clips from my friends in Niger and, well, more in Nigeria, on the Nigerian side of the boundary. I don't have to say anything about TikTok that is not known by the webinar participants today. I will say that the big problem in countries like Niger and Nigeria is that it being such a new phenomenon, and it being cell phone accessibility, not to mention sites that are so easily accessible, that so new, there's no basis of comparison, there's no way of judging the truth, the accuracy, the normative value, the potentially destabilizing value, the propaganda purposes of it all. So this really is the problem, that all these kinds of rumors are being disseminated and uncritically accepted by people who unfortunately have no basis of judging, discriminating against credible sources of news and information, and those that are not.
Thank you, Professor Miles. I'm going to, before I sign off, I'm going to toss to you, Robert, if you have any closing comments or remarks that you want to make.
Yeah, I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Professor Miles, for your outstanding presentation. I learned a lot about a lot. And I think I have a much better understanding of the country. And I'm sure many of our listeners were feeling the same way, just in terms of your depth of information and knowledge and experience with the country. So I wanted to thank you again for being part of this ASMEA webinar, and thank you all who are joining us and learning, I would say, from among the best in terms of the field and knowledge. So thank you. A warm thank you too for your presentation.
Thanks to ASMEA, and those of you who are not members, think about it.
That's called a shameless plug.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. This was a very interesting and very informative webinar. Certainly worthy of future discussions at ASMEA. I'd like to encourage everyone to also tune back in on Tuesday, May 7th, for our next webinar with Professor Ilan Trone. We will be discussing Israel, Palestine, and world religions, whose promised land. Until then, again, thank you, Professor Miles. Thank you, Robert. Take care, everybody.